Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 256, To the Amazon. In our last episode, Manco Inca's Great Rebellion sputtered out. There was no great climax. Instead, I guess I think about Manco's rebellion like the tide. It came in, failed to reach the sandcastle only inches from its apex, and then it receded. Manco came tantalizingly close to eliminating the Pizarro presence once and for all. But close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, as they say. At the end of our last episode, Manco made the gut-wrenching decision to abdicate control over 90% of his kingdom. He decided to make a tactical retreat to the Amazon rainforest. This was a place he was certain Pizarro could not and would not follow him. But as we will see today, Francisco Pizarro is nothing if not determined. From the central Andes, Manco and his followers made their way to the land of the Antis. The Antis Indians lived on the eastern foothills of the Andes as the mountains began to give way to the rainforest. These people were actually not indigenous to the region, if I'm being honest. These were settlers whom the Inca had long before forced to migrate. The Inca wanted a sort of border or buffer on their eastern flank, and the Antis provided that protection. The land was very good. The Antis were able to produce cocoa leaves and traded with the people of the inner Amazon. The largest town, and it really wouldn't be fair to call it any more than that, was Vitcos. Vitcos was only 70 miles from Cusco as the crow flies, and here Manco decided would be his new capital. Now, meanwhile, back in Cusco, things were not going well for the Pizarros. Almagro, who last time seized Cusco by force, had Hernando and Gonzalo Pizarro under lock and key, in direct defiance of Francisco's order. Almagro had by now decided he was going to take Cusco by force, regardless as to what Francisco might order or anyone else. There was no great empire to the south, and regardless, who was to say that Cusco was not in southern Peru and hence subject to his jurisdiction anyway? Almagro was going to hold Cusco at all costs, and appointed his second-in-command, Rodrigo Orgonez, a man who we met last time, a man who had been with Almagro for about 5 years. Orgonez was the son of poor Jewish shoemakers, who had been forced to convert to Christianity after the end of the Reconquista. In order to keep Cusco safe, Almagro ordered Orgonez to march out with a force of Spaniards and Incan auxiliaries to take out a nearby moderately sized force under the command of one of Pizarro's subordinates. So this is essentially an outright civil war at this point. Not only did Orgonez smash this force, but then he managed to convert much of this army's Spanish troops to Almagro's side. When Orgonez returned from this victory, he gave Almagro 2 pieces of advice. First, he said Almagro needed to execute the 2 Pizarro brothers immediately. If freed, Orgonez knew that Hernando and Gonzalo would seek to avenge their present humiliation. Second, he asked Almagro for permission to immediately launch an attack on Lima. Francisco Pizarro was weak at the present. If they took him and his brothers out, then they would be the undisputed leaders of Peru. Almagro did not take either piece of advice, and he would come to regret it. But for the moment, Almagro was concerned more about Manco Inca. He worried that if he committed his forces to attacking Lima, then Manco might attack a relatively undefended Cusco. So instead of finishing off the Pizarros, Almagro ordered Orgones to first capture or kill the rebel Inca emperor. It would be a decision he would come to regret. So in mid-July 1537, Orgones left Cusco at the head of an army of 300 Spanish cavalry and different foot soldiers. Very quickly, they found their path blocked by trees and boulders, deliberately placed there by Manco's troops. But by this time, Manco's brother, Paulu, was working with Almagro's faction. And once again, we see how local infighting allows a foreign power to dominate the situation. Paulu's men cleared the obstructions, and the army proceeded. Now, before the army left Cusco, Almagro had Paulu crowned emperor, further fracturing the Inca elite. Paulu had no intention of throwing in with his brother, and he had rebuffed multiple requests from Manco Inca to join him in Vitcos. According to one chronicler, quote, "Every day they sent messages to Paulu telling him to come and join them in Vitcos, as he had served long enough with the Christians. But Paulu warily replied that he was friends with these men, Almagro's faction, who were so courageous that no matter what they attempted, they always emerged victorious. And that when there were only 200 Spaniards in the city of Cusco, more than 2,000 Indians had been assembled to kill them, and the only honor and benefit they got from it was to leave many children fatherless and many women widows. More than 50,000 men died in the war, according to what he was told. Paulu advised the messengers and other Indians who were going back and forth from his camp not to take up arms against the Spaniards." End quote. Paulu was, like many people, an opportunist. He vastly preferred life as a puppet emperor living in luxury compared to a subordinate in some far-off jungle village. But for the moment, however, Manco had other things to worry about. A native runner had just reached him with news that a large Spanish force was making its way down the Lucumayo River on its way to the Aminibamba Valley, where Manco were presently visiting. If Manco didn't immediately flee, the messenger said, then the Spaniards would surely capture or kill him. Manco, therefore, climbed onto his royal litter and was borne across the river over the hanging bridge at Chichicacha, leaving instructions behind for the town's defense. Not long afterwards, Orgones and his men arrived and found a legion of native warriors defending the town. Again, according to the same chronicler as before, quote, "Orgones, as soon as he was quite close, ordered the crossbowmen to shoot many arrows, so that the Indians, seeing the damage that was being done to them, might decide that it was best to abandon the fort. To some extent, the Indians proved themselves to be brave and determined, defending the area and the fort and launching many darts and stones against the Christians. But the Spaniards wore them out so much that they were compelled to abandon that place, and to save their lives, they hurried to use their last resort, which was to flee. The Spaniards wreaked great havoc among them, leaving many of them dead or wounded." End quote. The next morning, Orgones crossed the bridge and reached the outskirts of Vitcos. Evidently, Manco's unreachable location was anything but. Manco was already gone by then, having fled further up into the mountains this time. And despite riding through the night, there was no sign of Manco to be found in or around Vitcos. The renegade emperor had, once more, seemingly vanished. Orgones did manage to capture Manco's son, Titu Cusi. This was very important, not so much for Orgones at the time, but for posterity. You see, Titu Cusi is the source of essentially all our knowledge about the Inca side of things during Manco's reign. So, whenever I have given you an eyewitness account of internal Inca affairs, generally that has come from the pen of Titu Cusi. Regardless, apart from the failure to capture Manco Inca, Orgonez's expedition had been a resounding success. The back of the insurrection had been broken. No matter where Manco fled, the reality was he would have hardly any followers left to lead. But back in Cusco, the political situation remained tenuous. No one had yet been able to determine whether Cusco lay within Almagro or Francisco Pizarro's half of Peru. For the moment, Almagro had vastly more military strength, and 2 of his brothers held prisoner. So Francisco decided he would be better to try to negotiate with his former partner. These negotiations worked back and forth through a go-between, an elderly lawyer named Gaspar de Espinosa. Espinosa's strategy was, frankly, just to get the 2 sides to agree to something. Anything. If Pizarro and Almagro agreed to some border, any border, somewhere, then the whole matter could later be brought to a final conclusion in Spain before the King's Council when they had time. The biggest problem, as Espinosa saw it, were the 2 Pizarro brothers in Almagro's custody. He knew, just like Orgonez, that they were likely, if not certain, to seek revenge if released, which he also knew would destroy any effort at peace. For months, these negotiations dragged on. All the while, fresh reinforcements continued to arrive in Lima, strengthening Francisco Pizarro's bargaining position. During this period, by the way, somehow, and honestly, I've read multiple different primary and secondary histories about this, and all of them just sort of flippantly throw this out there. But during this period, somehow, Gonzalo Pizarro manages to escape from prison. I don't know how, and joins his brother in Lima. Almagro was now faced with an excruciatingly difficult choice. Execute his remaining prisoner, Hernando Pizarro, or release him. Keeping him in custody indefinitely just wasn't going to be a long-term solution. So his captains all urged Almagro to just kill Hernando now, arguing that he would never forgive the old conquistador for keeping him locked up. But in the end, Espinosa, who was arguing to have the man released, arguably because Gonzalo, having been released, more or less just forces his hand at this point. I mean, there's no chance the Pizarros forgive Almagro if he executes Hernando at this point. There's maybe a tiny chance they forgive him if they do let him go. And Espinosa's argument seems to have gotten to Almagro. You know, the thing of it is Almagro, just kind of like Francisco Pizarro, is an old man, and now he's 63 years old. You know, he knew killing Hernando would mean civil war and didn't want that to happen. I mean, even if he won, by the time he won a protracted civil war, he would likely be in his late 60s or early 70s. So eventually he released Hernando on the man's pledge that he would uphold the peace. Of course, Almagro's captains, especially Orgonez, had been right. Within 2 months of his release, the civil war between the Pizarros and Almagro had been declared, and Hernando was right there in the middle of it. On Saturday, April the 26th, 1538, at dawn, amid a swampy area called Las Salinas, some 2 miles west of Cusco, 2 European armies faced each other preparing for battle. Francisco Pizarro, now 60 years old, had remained in Lima and had placed his 38-year-old brother Hernando in charge of recapturing the Inca's former capital. With the various reinforcements of men and supplies that had arrived in Lima, which had included a ship sent from Mexico by Cortez himself, Hernando now commanded a force of more than 800 Spaniards and several thousand native auxiliaries. At least 200 of Hernando's troops were mounted cavalry, fully armored and wielding lances and swords. These Hernando had divided equally and positioned on either of his two flanks. In the middle were 500 armored foot soldiers bearing shields and swords. In the front two rows stood 100 harquebus men. The guns were currently the vogue in European warfare, as their lead projectiles could penetrate the thickest of armor, thus eliminating the need for hand-to-hand combat. On the other side of the plain, Almagro's forces, 500 men compared to Hernando's more than 800, waited. These were comprised of 240 cavalry, about 260 foot soldiers, 6 cannon, and 6,000 native warriors bearing mace clubs and slings. The native warriors had been supplied by now Emperor Paulo Inca, who, like Manco, now wore the Scarlet Emperor's fringe and rode in his own royal litter. Almagro had instructed Paulo to position his warriors around the edges of the plain with orders to kill any Spaniard who tried to flee the battle, no matter which side they belonged to. Paulo dutifully transmitted the order to his captains. Almagro was now too sick to ride a horse, but he turned his army over to his second-in-command, Rodrigo Orgones, who had hoped in vain to prevent this battle which was about to unfold. According to one chronicler, quote, Governor Almagro had come out from Cusco in a litter with his army, and before arriving at Las Salinas, he reached a plain where he said to his captains that they would now see how the negotiations had ended up, and how he had been rejected, and how he would not be coming to battle if things had not broken down in such a manner, since war was a disservice both to God and his majesty, that they could now see how Hernando Pizarro and his brother, despite so many promises and negotiations, had come looking for them, while those who followed their banners did so because they believed that all the land would be divided up among them. Once they discovered that they had been deceived, however, they would never dare to start a war again. Since justice is on your side, he told the men, fight fiercely so that victory will be yours and that they will be punished severely. End quote. Hernando, meanwhile, took time to address his own men, many of whom were actually newly arrived in Peru and who, ironically, found themselves not about to fight the native insurgency that they had been summoned for, but instead against their own countrymen. Nevertheless, the Spaniards on both sides realized that if they were victorious on this day, then they would surely be rewarded with lands and spoils. The kingdom of Peru, each of the assembled combatants understood, was very much up for grabs. According to a chronicler again, quote, when he was a few miles away, Hernando Pizarro halted before his captains and his men and made a speech justifying his cause. He said that Almagro had incited the war, while he, Hernando, had been in Cusco striving for justice in the name of the king, and that Almagro had imprisoned him and treated him brutally, as everyone knew. But that, more as a point of honor than because of past injuries, he wanted to punish those who followed Almagro and who shared in his blunders, because they had helped him commit his past mistakes. And that now, by the order of the governor Francisco Pizarro, they had come to regain the city of Cusco and to free it from Almagro's oppressive rule. When the war was over, there would be many provinces and discoveries to divide among them, which would be awarded to them and not to any others. End quote. As the two forces readied themselves, Governor Almagro had a seat prepared for himself on a nearby hill where he could watch the battle unfold. On adjacent hills, a crowd of native onlookers stood in anticipation of a spectacle that they had never seen before. Two armies of bearded invaders, seemingly about to attack each other, in what the natives could only assume was the foreigners' version of an Inca-style civil war. Again, according to one chronicler, as the news of the battle that was about to be fought between the men of Chile and those supporting Pizarro spread far and wide, Natives from many towns came to attend, overjoyed that such a day had arrived, and believing that some satisfaction might be had for the injuries they had suffered from the Spaniards. They stood on the slopes and the hills, hoping that neither the Spanish captain would be victorious, but that somehow everyone would die and be killed with their own weapons. The wives of the Indian chiefs and the Spaniard servant girls also came out of the city and went to see who those were going to fight in the battle. Now, according to some, Rodrigo Ordoñez now rode up before his troops, encouraging them and boasting a good deal. He was a veteran of the Italian wars, and Ordoñez was certain that Hernando would not attack, even though he wielded superior numbers, as Hernando had to know the kind of carnage that his troops would suffer. Instead, Ordoñez told his men, walking back and forth briskly, sword drawn, Hernando's troops would surely break away at the last moment. They would attempt to race around their flanks, hoping to reach Cusco and seize it, and thus avoid open combat. On the cold, silent plains beyond Cusco, with the ownership of Peru hanging in the balance, and with Manco's spies, of course, watching from the hillsides, those Spaniards who had them closed their visors, the cavalrymen lifted their lances and unsheathed their swords. All looked at their commander, preparing and waiting for the signal to attack. Hernando Pizarro, his horse, snorting, presumably looking down his lines, then directly at Ordoñez across the plain from him, not taking his eyes from him, Hernando Pizarro raised his sword high, held it aloft for a moment, and then quickly brought it down. He was going to attack. Ordoñez had been wrong. 100 harquebus men now pulled their triggers, which brought a smoldering wick in contact with a line of powder leading directly to the barrel of the gun. The guns exploded, projecting lethal lead balls like invisible rockets toward Ordoñez's men. Hernando's crossbowmen, meanwhile, also fired their weapons, launching a volley of metal-tipped arrows at enemy troops. Behind them, Hernando's army now began advancing across the plain, obeying their orders to carry out a frontal assault. Ordoñez, stunned that Hernando was attacking instead of attempting to avoid a battle as he predicted, watched as huge clumps of his footmen and many horses and cavalrymen around him suddenly went down, as if their legs had been cut out from under them. Quote, Then the battle began, and Captain General Rodrigo Ordoñez, seeing that the enemy harquebusiers were gashing his troops, said to one of his captains, who commanded 50 cavalrymen, Charge, sir, with your squadron, and break up the harquebusiers. He, the captain, answered, Do you mean me to be butchered? Then Ordoñez raised his eyes to heaven and shouted, Protect me, Almighty God, and attacked the enemy single-handedly, a big, powerful man riding a powerful, light gray horse. And he speared a foot soldier and cut off the head of a harquebusier and wounded another in the thigh, returning to the ranks of his own men in the face of the enemy, end quote. And now the slaughter began. Both armies sort of smashed into each other, the footmen with swords and pikes, the cavalry with their lances, everyone shouting, ironically, Santiago or Long Live the King, both sides shouting the same thing on different occasions. Then the men joined together, the sounds of metal clanging, men shouting, horses neighing, and more arquebus explosions, which of course is startling the natives more than anything else. Decimated by Hernando's fierce weapons attack at the beginning and sorely outnumbered, Ordoñez's troops at first struggled to hold their ground. Then, under the full onslaught of Hernando's attack, they slowly began to fall back. Almagro's field commander nevertheless continued to fight fiercely from his horse, attempting to rally his troops by driving his sword under the open visor into a man's mouth and then slashing at another. Spurring his mount ever forward as his men continued to fall back, he entreated them not to retreat. Ordoñez swiveled and charged as volley after volley of bullets ripped his horse out from under him, throwing the marshal to the ground. Regaining his feet, Ordoñez continued to fight, although this time on foot with his sword. Soon, however, 6 of Hernando's men closed in, attacking the marshal simultaneously. As the men stabbed him repeatedly, Ordoñez finally fell. With shouts of triumph, several of the men now ran their swords completely through the marshal's body until their sword points impaled the stiff soil below. This son of Jewish cobblers, who had stolen a noble pedigree and who had hoped, like they had all hoped, to rule his own kingdom of natives, was finally dead. Shoving a sword into the base of Orgones's neck, the soldier now lifted the bloodied, bearded head on high for all of Pizarro's enemies to see. Almagro's troops now broke completely and began to flee, intent only on saving their lives. Now, at some point during the melee, Paulo Inca, who was watching all this, of course, and whose troops had been fighting on behalf of Almagro, abruptly and suddenly switched sides. Realizing that the battle was lost and abandoned now by even his own native litter-bearers, Diego de Almagro, who could see it all unfolding, desperately caught hold of a stray mule and began riding it back toward Cusco, kicking the animal in the sides to hurry it along. The Battle of Las Salinas, as it became known, was a complete rout. The losses were absolutely staggering. About 120 on Almagro's side, about 9, that single digit, 9 for Hernando. A few days later, Hernando Pizarro went to visit the defeated Almagro, a man with whom he had always competed with for power and who he had long despised. Despondent and worried about his fate, Almagro asked Hernando if his old partner, Francisco Pizarro, planned to come to Cusco so that the two might settle their differences. Hernando, knowing full well that his fate now lay in his hands, was uncharacteristically kind to the old conquistador. He assured him that his elder brother would be more than likely to visit, and that even if he were for some reason detained, well, Almagro could go visit Francisco Pizarro himself in Lima, in the City of Kings. Having reassured Almagro, Hernando left. Outside, however, he gave instructions to begin judicial proceedings against his brother's former partner, a necessary step before Almagro could be executed. For the next few weeks, Hernando reassured Almagro that his brother was sure to visit, and that he also made sure that his prisoner was well treated. Almagro, believing that the relationship between him and his former partner could somehow be repaired, waited impatiently for the elder Pizarro to arrive. What happens next is recorded by one chronicler as follows. Quote, Hernando Pizarro, having assembled a great body of armed men in the house, entered the prison cell of Governor Don Diego de Almagro, and notified him of the sentence of death. And when the unfortunate man heard it, he considered it to be an abominable deed, contrary to law, justice, and reason. He was astonished and replied that he would appeal to the emperor and king. Hernando responded that he, Almagro, should commend his soul to God because the sentence would be carried out. Then the poor old man fell to his knees and said, Commander Hernando Pizarro, content yourself with the revenge you've already enjoyed. Be aware that, besides the treason to God and the emperor that my death will cause, that you are repaying me poorly. For I was the first rung on the ladder by which you and your brother Francisco rose to power. Remember that when you were in my position, and my council members were begging me to cut off your head, I alone spared your life. End quote. It didn't do any good. On July the 8th, 1538, Diego de Almagro gave his last confession. At the last moment, as he stood waiting to be executed, Almagro turned to the men and tried to use guilt to dissuade them from going through with it. Quote, Gentlemen, doesn't all this land belong to the king? Then why do you want to kill me after I have done his majesty so many services? Be aware, because if you think that his majesty is presently far away, then it will soon seem that his power is quite near. And if you don't believe that there is a king here, then you better believe that there is a God who watches over everything. End quote. Hernando, however, at some point, just kind of got tired of all of this and decided, enough. He gave the order and told the men to get along with it. Almagro unable to believe that after having helped to conquer the largest native empire that had ever been discovered in the New World, this was how his life was going to end, and began to cry out, "You tyrants, you're stealing the king's land, and you are killing me for no reason." Now, this is all taking place inside of his jail cell, and no one can really see what's going on. In the street outside, muffled shouts were heard for a time, and then suddenly ceased. Not long afterward, the town crier emerged from Almagro's prison, and hurrying, was followed by a priest in a long black robe. Both headed up the street lined with Inca stone toward the main square, leaving the rounded corners of the Temple of the Sun behind. As they walked, the crier composed in his head the news he would soon shout out to Cusco's streets for one and all to hear, namely, that Don Diego de Almagro, governor of the Kingdom of New Toledo and native of Spain, was dead. Not long after Almagro's death, news reached Cusco that Manco Inca had a new capital. Located deep in the Amazon rainforest, the town of Vilcabamba was now the capital of the new Inca Free State. It had only one law. Any Spaniard was to be killed on sight. Vilcabamba is only 30 miles from Manco's previous capital. It was about 100 miles from Cusco, but it was more or less in the heart of the jungle. Manco was supremely confident that Pizarro would never find him here. Immediately, he began remaking the town into a new imperial capital. Despite his recent setback, and yes, that term is an understatement, Manco still intended to keep up his goal of ejecting the Spanish from Peru. From his capital, he maintained his lines of communication that snaked westward from Vilcabamba. He continually sent messages out saying one thing and one thing only: resist. Resist the invaders at all costs. It was not over. And, he wasn't wrong. Pizarro, even though he had emerged from the conflict with Almagro successfully, still had less than 2,000 Spaniards in an empire that was over 2,500 miles long. A rule of modern warfare is that an occupying army should have a ratio of somewhere between 10 to 20 soldiers per 1,000 inhabitants. Hence, to control the 5 million inhabitants of the Inca Empire, the Spaniards theoretically needed 50,000 to 100,000 soldiers. So, Francisco Pizarro was a tad short. When news reached Manco of Almagro's death, his resolve only stiffened. At one point, he hoped that the Civil War might break out between the Spaniards and tear them apart. That hope was gone now. He knew he had to rely on his own resources. Manco himself had no intention of staying in Vilcabamba. He was soon back in the Andes, north of Cusco, personally organizing bands of guerrilla fighters. And he was incorporating a new tactic into his campaign: outright terror. According to one chronicler, quote, "The king, Manco Inca, had retired into the mountain fastness of the Ontezuni region, with the Orejones and old military leaders who had made war on the Spaniards. And as the merchants from Lima and other areas carried their goods to Cusco, the Indians attacked them, and after seizing their goods, they either murdered them or carried some of the way alive. And returning with them on horseback to their mountain strongholds, they tortured those Christians they had taken alive in the presence of their women, revenging themselves for the injuries they had suffered by shoving sharp stakes into the lower parts of their bodies until they came out their mouths. This news caused such terror that many Spaniards who had private or even government business didn't dare go to Cusco unless they were well armed and had an escort." End quote. After receiving reports that Manco had returned, Pizarro quickly appointed a lieutenant to track him down, capture, or kill him. And they almost did. The Spanish raiding party got so close that Manco was forced to saddle one of the captured horses and flee. Manco had never learned to read, but evidently he had learned to ride. The Spanish followed him, but quickly they walked into a trap. As the men struggled up the slope of the mountain pursuing Manco, one of them suddenly shouted a warning, causing the Spaniards to look up and see the silhouettes of what appeared to be numerous warriors on the hilltop above. The Spaniards were further stunned to see racing down toward them 4 natives on horseback, carrying lances, with many more warriors racing behind them on foot. Caught by surprise on a steep path with a sheer drop-off below, 7 crossbowmen raised their weapons to fire as a handful of harquebussers desperately tried to light the wicks of their guns. As Manco's warriors began hurling down sling stones and darts from above, a few harquebussers fired, causing 1 native to die instantly, but by then Manco's warriors were among them, smashing the Spaniards with their mace clubs, hurling sling stones, and pressing the Spaniards back down the trail so forcefully that many of the Spaniards and their horses simply tumbled off the slope, the men screaming briefly before hitting the ground far below. Manco and his 4-horse cavalry, meanwhile, effectively used their lances to stab and skewer the remaining Spaniards, who presumably had never before been attacked by natives on horseback. After a fierce struggle, the battle ended in a rout. The captain, covered in wounds and with his arm broken by a native battle axe, had eventually fallen to the ground. He had committed 2 fatal errors. First, he had allowed himself to be caught by surprise on steep terrain, where he and his Spaniards were unable to use their horses. And second, he had allowed Manco's warriors to attack them from the heights above. Of the 30 men, 28 were killed, or else fell to their deaths. Only 2 escaped. Despite his success, Manco knew that his present military situation was far different from the one he had enjoyed years prior. Manco had far fewer troops, so he needed to avoid direct confrontations with Pizarro. He needed to fight a true guerrilla war, based on ambush and hit-and-run tactics. His goal was to kill small groups of Spanish soldiers, steal their horses and arms, and incorporate this superior military technology into his army. If given enough time, I think this might have worked. But the reality was Manco did not have enough time. Not long after the latest ambush, Francisco Pizarro led a force of cavalry out of Cusco in pursuit of Manco Inca. Manco was already moving back east, however. Catching him would not be an easy task. As he moved, Manco fired off messengers to his supporters across the realm. To the south of Cusco, his high priest, Villac Umo, was still holed up in a mountain. After receiving a message from Manco, he began organizing resistance and carrying out orders to attack Spaniards anywhere and everywhere. Frightened encomienda owners found themselves once more being forced to travel with armed guards for protection. These people would have to fend for themselves. Francisco and his men were heading north. They still knew that if they could cut off the head of the snake, then the entire rebellion would probably melt away. Gonzalo Pizarro was left behind in Cusco, with instructions to begin a campaign of terror in the region. If this was to be an insurgency, then they would treat it like one. There would be no distinction made between combat men, women, and children. Everyone was to be treated as an enemy, and no one given any quarter. In April of 1539, as the counterinsurgency in the north continued, Francisco, Hernando, and Gonzalo Pizarro met in Cusco in order to discuss their plans for their next steps in the conquest/reconquest of Peru. Because of the complications caused by Almagro's execution, Francisco thought it best that Hernando return to Spain to exonerate himself. Hernando had too many enemies by now, Francisco believed, who could poison the king's ear and who could turn the king against Hernando and, as a result, the rest of the Pizarro family. If his brother took with him a newly chronicled, written, series of events that featured, obviously, Hernando as an Indian fighter during siege and a hero, and of course, buckets upon buckets of new gold for the king. Then Francisco felt that his brother should be able to successfully plead his innocence. Gonzalo, by contrast, who was now 27, thought that the plan was terrible. It would be best for Hernando to remain in Peru, he argued, and if necessary, for him to just wait here, lance and sword at the ready. In Spain, Hernando could be at the mercy of his enemies, and with none of his family there to help him. Hernando, however, answered angrily, saying that Gonzalo was just a boy and didn't know the king. In any case, Hernando had already made up his mind, so none of this really mattered. He would return to Spain, and he would meet with the king. Then, once the issue of Almagro's execution had been taken care of, he would go ahead and petition the king for additional favors. In other words, Hernando took a very rosy view of the situation. On the day of his departure, Francisco Gonzalo and a small group of conquistadors accompanied Hernando a short way out of town and then dismounted from their horses to say goodbye. Hernando embraced both of his brothers before taking pains to warn Francisco about the potential danger of Almagro's followers, those who had gone with the now dead governor of Chile and who had fought against the Pizarros and who were still bitter and destitute. According to Pedro Pizarro, quote, Hernando Pizarro, on taking leave of his brother, the Marquis, said to him, "You know that I am going to Spain, and that, besides God, that we're all depending on you. I say this because those from Chile are behaving very disrespectfully. If I weren't going away, there would be nothing to fear." And he told the truth because they were very afraid of him. Make friends with them and give them something to eat to those who wish it, but do not allow even 10 of those who want nothing to gather together within 50 leagues from wherever you are. For if you do, they're bound to kill you. Hernando Pizarro said these words aloud. We all heard them, and embracing the Marquis, he set off and went away. End quote. One thing that all the brothers agreed upon before Hernando's departure was that Manco Inca had to be exterminated. Shortly thereafter, Gonzalo began organizing another expedition with the goal of finding and killing the rebel emperor. 300 Spaniards immediately volunteered for the expedition, both cavalry and infantry. This time, Paulu would go along and give the expedition at least the veneer of legitimacy from Inca eyes. Paulu was desperate to see Manco Inca dead. So long as he lived, there was a chance that Paulu could be supplanted. But if Manco died, then Paulu was the Spaniards' last chance at a puppet emperor. So in April 1539, after Hernando departed, the expedition at last set out. Before long, the Spaniards were descending the mountains and following their native guides into the dark, twisting world of the Amazon. For them, the experience must have been like visiting an alien planet. The impressive heat and humidity caused the men to sweat profusely through their armor. The dense vegetation meant that they could not see perhaps more than 5 yards in any direction. It was dark. It smelt of decay, and strange sounds echoed all around them. Plus, there was not a question of if they would be attacked, but when they would be attacked. One Jesuit priest wrote as follows, quote, "Those who live in the Amazon eat human flesh. They are fiercer than tigers, have neither God nor law, nor know what virtue is. They have no idols nor likenesses of them. They worship the devil when he represents himself in the form of some animal or serpent and speaks to them. If they make a prisoner in war, you know that he is a plebeian of low rank. They quarter him and give the quarters to their friends and servants to eat or to sell in the meat market. But if he is of noble rank, the chiefs gather with their wives and children, and like ministers of the devil, they strip him, tie him alive to a stake, cut him into pieces with flint knives and razors, so as not to dismember him, but to remove the meat from the fleshiest parts of the calves, thighs, buttocks, and fleshy parts of the arm. Men and women sprinkle themselves with the blood, and they all devour the flesh very rapidly without cooking it or roasting it thoroughly or even chewing it. They swallow it in mouthfuls so that the wretched victim sees himself eaten alive." End quote. Walking single file, the Spaniards arrived at a canyon through which two streams flowed. Crossing over the two bridges that had been recently constructed, they now emerged into a clearing that had high bluffs on either side and was filled with the sound of rushing water. Pedro Pizarro later recalled, "When some Spaniards had crossed the bridge, the Indians who were hidden hurled down many boulders from the mountains above. These boulders are huge stones that they throw from above and which come rolling down with great fury. These boulders carried away 3 Spaniards, smashing them into bits and knocking them into the river. Those Spaniards who had already gone ahead into the forest found many Indian archers who began to shoot arrows at them and to wound them. And had they not found a narrow path from which they threw themselves into the river, they would have all been killed, for they could not come to grips with the Indians who were hidden among the trees. The Spaniards had blundered into a trap. According to the report of Titu Cuzi, quote, "My father, Manco Inca, heard from the spies he had stationed on the roads how Gonzalo Pizarro and many others were coming after them, and that 3 of his own brothers were coming with them. And he, Manco, went there and found I don't know how many Spaniards, because the forest was so thick you couldn't count them. And he fought with them fiercely on the banks of the river." End quote. Those bridges that the Spaniards had crossed, it turned out, had recently been built by Manco's warriors in order to purposely divert the Spaniards from the normal trail and lead them into the area where they could be crushed by falling rocks. It was the ambush by boulder technique that was the same that had been used by Manco's great general Quiso. However, Manco's warriors bungled the job and had released the boulders too soon. The ambush, nevertheless, caused the long Spanish and Inca column to stop dead in its tracks. After fierce fighting throughout the day, and with the Spaniards hardly able to see the attackers, so well did the native Amazonians use the forest to hide in, the Spaniards finally retreated. That night, Gonzalo and his men retraced their steps by torchlight, back to where they had left their horses, in order to regroup and decide what to do. Demoralized by their recent casualties, and by the shadowy Indians who could let loose volleys of arrows, yet who could scarcely be seen, the Spaniards sent to Cusco for reinforcements. Now, at this point, all that really stands between Manco and the Spanish army pursuing him was a single canyon blocked by a large stone outcropping that formed a natural barricade. The Incas got around said barricade with ladders, which of course they had now removed. In addition, Manco had ordered a stone wall with windows be erected on the top of said outcropping, making the defense more formidable. With hundreds of armed Spaniards now only a little more than a dozen miles from his capital, and according to his spies, with more Spanish reinforcements gathering in Cusco, those are the ones Gonzalo sent for, he had to find a way to destroy his enemies, or else make life so difficult that they had to give up and return to the Andes. Gonzalo Pizarro soon decided to mount a frontal attack against the barricade, sending a force ahead with orders to seize it. As the Spaniards began attempting to scramble up the stone outcrop and reach the wall, Manco chose this right moment, however, to reveal his latest military innovation. Loud explosions suddenly erupted, and blasts of smoke issued from the perforations in the wall directly before the attackers. Spanish prisoners, apparently, had shown Manco's warriors how to fire his stockpile of captured harquebuses, seized from Spaniards. It was for this reason that Manco had left the small openings in the wall on top of the barricade. After the stunned Spaniards had retreated and then began to examine the wall carefully, they could see the barrels of the harquebuses manufactured in Spain drawing direct lines of fire on them. While surprising, Manco's innovation was hardly decisive, and after days of skirmishing, the stalemate between the two sides simply wore on. The Spanish were unable to break through Manco's stone wall, but with reinforcements from Cusco, Gonzalo decided he would try something a little more innovative. He had half of his men conduct a feint. They peppered the defenders with a series of half-hearted but constant attacks. Then, the other half of his men snuck around the outcropping and scaled the canyon edge so as to get to the heights above. As the natives focused on defending their position from the men below, they suddenly found themselves under attack from crossbowmen and harquebuses from above. Forced to retreat, Manco, again, made the painful decision to withdraw from his most recent capital. Gonzalo and his troops followed the stone causeway until they reached Vilcabamba, until now a city that they had only heard about in legend. It stretched out about a mile before them in a forest clearing, but it was totally deserted. So in July 1539, Gonzalo gave up his latest chase for Manco and returned to Cusco. Exhausted upon hearing the news, Francisco Pizarro decided to return to the coast, to Los Reyes, and continue the work of building his capital on the sea. Pizarro believed this time it was really over. Manco Inca had been chased from yet another jungle capital. It was over. The Great Rebellion was at an end. But Pizarro's troubles were not, of course. Just as it seemed he had beaten the enemy from without, word reached him that he had a new enemy. One from within. If you've enjoyed the show, check out the links in the show notes. I've got links to the website there with additional content. If you'd like ad-free versions of the show for $1 a month, you can get those on the Patreon feed. Or if you'd like to enjoy the whole episode over again from the very beginning, ancient Babylonia and so on and so forth, check out a free 7-day trial of Western Civ 2.0. It's got way better audio quality and a lot more depth than the first time I tried it. Free 7-day trial, just click the link.